This idea that Carla was mentioning about the protection of territories, it's so deep when you think, is fashion, how is fashion related to the lives of people, to the identities, to cultural survival, and to the protection of territories? And it is, because the world is an ecosystem. We're just not only in our little bubble. We are all connected. It's so important. One of the people that has been fundamental in this, and has had over 20 years of work and sustained advocacy in this space is Lucy Mulenkei. She cannot be with us today because, as always, she is participating in the Conference of the Parties. Francis was mentioning one of them, the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And there, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the Conference of the Party on Climate issues that is happening now. This was the last day in Azerbaijan. Lucy has been and is a great mentor and an ally, and we have been supporting the perspectives and the rights-based approach proposed by the indigenous and local communities in the international fora. Lucy is part of the Maasai pastoralist community in Kenya, and I have met her as the co-chair of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. And because she couldn't be here today with us, and we had difficulties in recording the message, I'm sharing a few key messages from her work in the last 20 years, but most recently, or most focused on this issue, the dynamic between the intellectual property system and the traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions of indigenous peoples, ethnic groups, and local communities. The premise of the work that Lucy and the whole IIFB do is that indigenous peoples and local communities are ancestral guardians of Mother Earth. The idea of guardianship and custodianship is so much embedded from generation to generation in the way communities relate to their territories that they take care of. And in many contexts, they have been displaced from these territories. Many people have lost their lives for the protection of nature and biocultural diversity. Carla and Dani were also mentioning this term specifically, biocultural diversity. And you see, it's important. The UN Convention says biodiversity, but to indigenous peoples, ethnic groups, and local communities, there's no difference between culture and biology in the sense that it's one. Biocultural diversity is something that they approach holistically. This is also one of Lucy's messages in one of her presentations at WIPO in 2019, when this negotiation on the what is now 3 different treaties on protection of traditional knowledge and genetic resources and protection of traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. She was saying that these 2 notions, the knowledge and the expressions, are interconnected. And this is a crucial perspective because for indigenous peoples and local communities, there's no distinctiveness between the knowledge and the expression, as Western thinking does and Western intellectual property law does. So that's an important idea to have in mind. Another key message is that indigenous peoples have a holistic perspective on traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. And in practice, the 2 are linked. For example, an indigenous people's cloth, a tool, or a handcraft is considered in this terminology a traditional cultural expression, but obviously it's used to make that expression. And it's at the same time, the knowledge of creating that tool or of using that tool is traditional knowledge. And so any legal approach or any kind of tool that is used, whether it is something like impact measurement tool or all kinds of, now we have artificial intelligence and different tools that are used, a lot of things that keep coming up in, let's say, a Western paradigm. How are they taking into account this interconnectedness and holism that is part of the way of living and knowing of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Another key message that Lucy shares is that not this idea that the knowledge of communities is to be exploited or to be taken without consent is very wrong, and a lot of this knowledge is sacred and secret. So it's very important that free, prior, and informed consent is given, and this also implies the right to say no or deny access. It should be respected and ensured. And it's very important to also understand that to have the resources for the capacity building of the communities, to know what their rights are, and also to be ready to enforce them, this is also important. So we start a lot of times from a space of imbalanced power dynamics and access to resources, where some communities don't have the resources to enforce their rights. And lastly, this idea of documenting traditional knowledge that we do so much, taking pictures and creating databases. It's important to create them, like we saw in Tara's example, with free, prior, informed consent, and to understand what is going to be the protection mechanism. And when we say protection, it doesn't mean only the intellectual property protection in that sense, but how do we ensure that this buen vivir, that the well-being of the communities and that their interests are protected. This was a short message. I wish Lucy was here, and I think it's very important to follow the work that the IIFB and other organizations that are active at UN level do to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples, ethnic groups, and local communities, because we saw also now when we were in Cali at COP16, there's little representative from the fashion and creative spaces. It's a space where you don't have these people coming because now the big challenge is to really convince governments to implement frameworks nationally to protect the rights of communities. They have so many battles kind of to lead at the same time, but we can be allies as a creative industry that is looking to be ethical, and not only to create this harmony, to create cultural sustainability. We can be allies of the communities and be in those spaces as supporters and allies of the communities.